Welcome everybody to today's AWIC Future of Work webinar. We're going to get going in a couple minutes. I've just started the webinar to let everybody join in, and so we're just waiting on all the attendees to load into Zoom, and then we'll get started. So it'll just be a couple minutes. Thank you. All right, I'm going to kick things off here. And once again, welcome to everybody joining our webinar today, and thank you for joining us. Today is our last Future of Work webinar in our Future of Work webinar series. My name is Jonathan Coleman. I'm Executive Director of AWIC. Hopefully you were able to join us for some of our other webinars that we had in the Future of Work webinar series. If you weren't able to join us, we actually have been recording the webinars, and you can go back and watch our previous webinars in the series on our AWIC home site. So awic.ca, and if you go to the events page, you'll see where those have been recorded. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping. Our webinar today is going to be about an hour, and we will have plenty of time for question and answers. If you do have a question, we ask you to put it into the chat in the webinar, so you should see the chat function for you. Just enter in your question. You can put it in as you think of it, and then we're going to answer all those questions at the end of the presentation. Your audio is actually muted as an audience member, so that's why we ask you to put it into chat. We are recording the webinar, so if this is something you want to return to or share with colleagues, you certainly will be able to do that. And again, it'll be posted on the awic.ca website. And finally, just in terms of housekeeping, at the end of the webinar, when you exit, you will be asked to fill out a short survey. If you could do that, that would really help us. It helps us, lets us know how we're doing with these webinars, and also gives you a chance to suggest future topics or areas that you would like us to cover. So without further ado, I am going to introduce today's speaker. So I'm very excited to welcome Tricia Williams here today. She is Director, Research, Evaluation and Knowledge Mobilization at the Future Skills Center. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Future Skills Center, it is a pan-Canadian organization that is passionate about creating a future in which everyone has lifelong access to high quality career advice and learning opportunities. So the mission of the FSC is to strengthen Canada's skills development ecosystem so that Canadians can look to a future of meaningful and relevant lifelong learning opportunities. Again, we're very fortunate to have Tricia join us. She leads pan-Canadian research strategy focused on advancing FSC's strategic goals. And she brings a very strong and diverse background across anthropology, sociology, and economic disciplines to her role as Future Skills Center, again, Director of Research Evaluation and Knowledge Mobilization. She has a particular expertise in the future of work, including digital economies, skills development, migration, and gender. So clearly we've got the right person here to talk about the future of work and what it means to Canada and also what it means to Algoma. So welcome, Tricia. I'm just going to do a little swap here of slides and get your presentation up.
Thanks so much,
But
Jonathan. It's nice to be welcomed so warmly, and I think there's nothing more painful than listening to your own bio. But thank you. It's really an honor to be invited to speak with you today. And I was telling Jonathan last week when we spoke about how I grew up hearing about the North so much because my parents did a couple years in Elliott Lake, Ontario, and so when we would take family trips to Northern Ontario, I would hear about it and hear the stories of their time there. So it's full circle for me. I was telling my parents that we were going to have this conversation, so it's great to be here.
Excellent, Tricia. You're already winning over the audience just by mentioning Elliott Lake. So thank you.
I'm from the South Ontario. I am. I fully disclose it. But yes, I grew up on a farm too. Don't forget that. So so I have those rural roots. But it's really a pleasure to be with you and to share a little bit about what FSC is doing. And as Jonathan said, we're thinking a lot about the future of work in Canada, and are really have been created to tackle that challenge of thinking about the future of work and working with many diverse skills ecosystem players. And I'll talk a little bit about what we mean when we say the skills ecosystem, what that actually looks like. But I think, the people on this call and who are joining in today, I hope you'll ask questions in the chat, because I think the real work of making this happen is, in the training institutions, colleges, universities, employers, all the different players that are involved, that come around these labor market challenges. So really, I hope that you see this as a conversation, and we want to learn from you about what that means for the Algoma region too. So if we move to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about the Future Skills Center. So we just had our 3rd birthday, and like most toddlers, we're still growing and changing and figuring out who we are and how to do it. But we've had a really, I think, a pretty rapid paced and exciting first 3 years. So we have a mandate from the federal government. We have a funding from the federal government through 2024 to strengthen Canada's skills development ecosystem, and really with a focus on thinking about how we're going to really create a learning nation that is committed to learning throughout the life course for Canadians, and that Canadians can thrive in the future of work. So we do that through a lot of innovation and learning. So we, if anyone's gone around our website, you may see all the different projects we're doing. I mean, the slide says here 140. I think we're up to 170 total. Some of them are research projects where we're trying to understand different parts of the skills picture. Others are what we call innovation projects, where we're working with different partners across Canada to innovate and try new things around skills development and learning. So we have a strategic plan that involves a few pillars that I'll talk about briefly. But the Future Skills Center is composed of a consortium. So we have the center, which is based at Ryerson University. We also work closely with the Conference Board of Canada and with an evaluation and research firm called Blueprint. And we're funded by the Future Skills Program through the federal government at Employment and Social Development Canada. So we, I should also mention at Ryerson University, we also work very closely with two centers at Ryerson, Magnet, which is a technology enterprise within the university, and the Diversity Institute. So I'm sitting in the research shop at the center itself and working closely with all these partners and the 160 funded partners we have across the country to really fulfill our mandate. So we have a few things we're focused on at the center, And one of them is labor market information, thinking about how do we improve the labor market information for people who need it. We have a close partnership with the Labor Market Information Council, if you've heard of them. We also are focused on career development and skills training. Also working very closely with employers and thinking about sectors of the future. And then really taking a learning focus to all three of those pillars and saying what's working for whom and under what conditions. So we have a mandate for innovation and testing. So I want to, if you go to the next slide, what I want to focus on today, because, a lot of that operational stuff is like, blah, not super relevant to everyone out there. What I really wanted to talk about today was some of the things that we're seeing, first in terms of mega trends, what we're paying attention to and things shaping the present and future of work, give a little bit of the big picture of what we're seeing across Canada as a whole. But then we want to really distill into some of the key issues in the skills ecosystem that we're focusing on. And this is a little bit like some of the problems we're trying to solve for. We'll talk a bit about some of the critical priorities, and I'll give some examples from some of our projects about what we're seeing and learning, and then really close off with that some of the things we're learning. And I should say that as a 3-year-old, a lot of the first couple years of our involvement as a center was getting up and running, launching calls for proposals, developing that network of partnerships across the country. And of course, like everyone, we're doing this in the midst of COVID and staffing up and operating a remote organization. But now we have an opportunity to really shift our focus. And some of these grants are coming to a conclusion. We've run some training programs, we've been working with employers, and now we're able to wrap things up and say, okay, well, what did we learn through this process? And part of my role and that of my team is to help surface and share those insights. So I think you'll be seeing a lot more from us in the coming months and over the next year and a half of our mandate in sharing what's come out of these pilot projects and these innovations. Okay, so if we go forward, we'll talk a bit about some of the mega trends. And I want to say that this isn't an exhaustive list. This isn't everything that's happening. And maybe there are other things, that you're seeing as well. Like certainly we know supply chains right now are some things really shaping many, many issues. But I think one of the things we're paying attention to are some of the big picture issues and things that might shape how Canada is positioning itself in the next 10 to 20 years. So when we think about, how do we ensure that Canada's future includes opportunities and prosperity for all? So one of the things we'll say is, we're noticing that there's existing inequities within the labor market that are being magnified. I'll talk about that later again, but certainly I think it's been very clear through the COVID period that certain groups and certain communities have been more affected by job losses or exposure to unsafe working conditions or the differential kind of recovery benefits. So we're paying attention to how those existing inequities take place in the labor market. And even without the COVID backdrop, just thinking about the increasing polarization, job polarization, that, used to be you could, get a reasonable kind of job and opportunity without investing too much in education or skills training. And now, of course, we're seeing that, there can be a missing middle in that there's a lot of like highly paid, highly specialized jobs, and there's lower paid, lower status, lower opportunity jobs and that missing middle. So we're paying attention to this polarization and saying, how do we make sure that Canada's future is inclusive and has opportunities for people to have a dignified and fulfilling life? At the same time, we're also seeing unequal access to training opportunities based on income, geography, and background. And I would suspect that you guys are in the Algoma region are well aware of all the kind of resources or programs or materials that might be available in larger urban centers, for example. We're paying attention to how this plays out across different provinces and territories in Canada, how this plays out between rural and urban areas, and how it plays out for, historically marginalized groups like First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, including in the North. So there are certainly some opportunities now with COVID and more technology delivered training opportunities to think differently about that. But we're also thinking about, how we can make sure that that is part of our future. We're also seeing, of course, technology continues to disrupt labor markets. Classic example, taxi drivers. I like to joke that, when I was in high school, my high school guidance counselor, I did an aptitude test and they said, you'd make a really good taxi dispatcher. And well, I'm really glad I didn't go into the taxi field because, I would have been demolished by Uber and so on, ride hailing services. But at its core, we're seeing technology disrupt labor markets in many countries around the world, and global market forces are reshaping, what the kinds of skills are needed. Climate change also is going to be a big driver of changes, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, about how we're taking a really explicit focus on green skills, not only within kind of traditional things you might think of like energy sectors, but also how climate change and adaptation to climate changes are driving everything, including skills needed for trades or construction work or things that you might not traditionally think of as green skills and green sectors. We also know that there's uneven access to workplace-based skills training. So I work for a university. I'm allowed to take courses at the university free of charge. I have professional development resources available to me. Obviously, not everyone has that kind of that shared opportunity. And especially as we move into a world in which more and more people are self-employed or working in a gig economy, we're going to see changes in that uneven access to workplace-based skills training. We're also trying to wrap our heads around how much employers are investing in skills training, because we know that many employers do want to invest in skills training, and we're trying to get a handle on what that looks like. And we also know that, we have certain population dynamics underway right now where Canada is really looking to immigrants, older workers to fill labor market gaps. And this is a bit of an unusual situation. We haven't had this kind of labor shortages in a long time. So so those are some of the mega trends. I mean, I'm sure there's some comments and questions in the chat already. I'll have to look at those after, but not an exhaustive list, but some of the things I think we're paying attention to, both on a global scale as well as situating within kind of the nuances of Canada's ecosystem. So if we move on to the next one. So I said we'd talk about a few of the key issues and how they relate to some of the work that we're doing. So the first one I want to talk to is technology and the pivot to digital work. So if we go down to the next slide. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm having some internet snafus here, so it's not without its challenges, and I thought it would be less risky if I didn't run the slides. So some of the things we're seeing about technology and the shift to digital work is that it's really cutting across many different sectors. So we have several projects with different entities working on kind of retail and service work. And there's really, maybe you've seen it maybe at your local grocery store, there's a self-checkout, for instance, or there's more online shopping. So we're really seeing a lot of predictions that retail and service workers jobs are likely to decline. Then you think, okay, well, what do we do to prepare people for that shift? They need workers now, but maybe they need to have higher technology capability to run or repair machines or things that fall down, or really focus on the customer service dimensions. Also, we have looked at the insurance industry, which is disproportionately female. They tend to be lower skilled jobs, and they are really predicted to be affected by digital transformation, things that can be automated and moved into more kind of algorithmic or digital work. At the same time, we are recognized that it isn't this single story of, the robots are taking our jobs and automation is going to replace people in the future. That isn't the storyline, actually, uniformly. In many cases, we think that technology tools will augment and support the work that humans do. So we have a project with the Michener Institute at the University of Health Network in Toronto, looking at how clinicians, doctors, nurses can use AI in healthcare to support their decision making. And this is more about, enabling people to do a better job and let them focus on what they can do really well, which is the patient interaction or explaining the model of care and how to humanely interpret technology. We also have some work to train truck drivers and thinking about virtual reality as a way to train them. We've heard recently about truck driver shortages, in a really aging population in the midst of a time in which we need to be very, very aware of the movement of goods around the country and between different supply chains. So these are all ways in which we say, that shift to technology is not just about coders and programmers in the tech sector, but it's all sorts of transformations that are happening across various sectors up and down supply chains. And I'm guessing, I don't know exactly who's on this call, but I'm guessing that some of you will have very close lived experience of this in your own work environment. So these are the sort of things we're trying to test and innovate around in these specific things and saying, how can we do that better? How can we make sure that, we're trying new things and we're not just doing the training of 10 years ago to address the problems of 10 years from now. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide. Okay, I think this is just some stats around the projections about jobs at risk due to automations of 20%. But I think in general, we're seeing a lot of people have pretty optimistic views of AI. And like I said, I think we're investigating ways in which AI can be used for good. And how do we do that in an ethical and humane way? And, projected increases, we see this that, businesses are implementing AI processes. You're seeing this being more widely adopted. And we know that, we're just at the beginning of the tip of transformation around this. So next slide, please, Jonathan. So we have, just want to make it a little bit concrete about what this looks like in some of our programs and pilots. So we're working with a group called the Immigration Employment Council in British Columbia that's around facilitating access to skilled talent. And so one of the things we've seen, and perhaps this is true in your area as well, there's a big focus in Canada on bringing in newcomers, immigrants to Canada to fill some labor gaps. We have a skilled employment program, skilled immigration program, where we're recruiting immigrants based on their skills and education and experience. And one of the things I think that's been noted a lot is that many immigrants aren't able to, enter into their professions or use their skills to full capacity in Canada. So this program, we've really invested in saying, can we do some pre-arrival labor market information sharing with immigrants so they get a better sense of what Canadian labor market's like, any certifications or assessments they need to do in their chosen field, and as well as maybe do a little bit of training or upskilling to say, here's what's needed in this field. So we did some work in skilled trades, we did some work in biotech, life sciences, and IT, had some really, really strong results. And that, within a few weeks of arrival in Canada, we're seeing these clients with that early intervention finding positions in their field. We've recently expanded our partnership with FAST to test out how this would work with some really in-demand areas such as personal support workers in the healthcare sector. So, we've heard a lot about the shortage of nursing and personal support workers, and we're saying, okay, if we are recruiting people in Canada to fill those roles, what do they need? How do they need to be assessed, or how can they upgrade their skills to be able to practice that way in Canada? So we're seeing some really positive results when we research and evaluate those program interventions. So that's a little example of that. And I'd say all of that is delivered through technology remotely, oftentimes before the immigrant even sets foot in Canada. So if we turn to the next slide, I think this is on the learning bulletin we did. Yes. So one of the things we're doing is increasingly, we have, this one is up on our website. And so feel free to I'm sure I can pull up the link after and drop it in the chat, or maybe Sylvia can help me with that. We have a learning bulletin on our website, which is looking at several of our projects, looking at artificial intelligence and trying to map out, what is this meaning? What are we learning? What's coming out of these projects? Sometimes we don't necessarily have the answers from the project yet, but we can at least say, here's what we're thinking about paying attention to. And we will be sharing those results as they're available. We're working on some other learning bulletins on similar topics now, but that's part of what we're trying to do, is not just do the pilots, but make sure we can share the information that we're learning from them. So if we go on to the next one. Okay, so one of the other areas we're really focusing on in terms of key issues is thinking about how do we prepare both employers and workers and the whole skills ecosystem, training organizations, to pivot before sector-wide changes are even underway. So, the tagline about this is, we can't completely predict what the skills and jobs of the future are. We can say directionally where we think things are going to go. But what we can prepare for is the fact that we need to be agile, we need to be constantly evolving, and in some ways, COVID has been the best and hardest learning experience of that of all. So if anything, this is, this constant iteration and changing and keeping an open mind to adapting our business models, adapting our practices, and learning as we go is, in some ways, the new normal. Hopefully not without the degree of variability and uncertainty we've had in COVID, but certainly these are the kinds of directions we expect skills and training to go in the next coming years. So if we go down a slide, I'll tell you one example of this. So we have a project with focus on material handling. So this is around material handling is a specific aspect of handling hazardous materials, and there was a specific need for this in Hamilton, Ontario, where there were acute labor shortages because there were certain technological skills that were shifting, that were needed. There was an aging workforce, and this is a program that's really targeting adults. But it's run in conjunction with the community college and people from specifically disadvantaged groups, including people with who've maybe had sporadic employment, or people from racialized minorities and immigrants, and really helping them transition into job opportunities and refining skills for the field. So we recently expanded the project to work with 3 more community colleges, so expanding it and scaling it up across Canada to thinking about what this looks like. And this is really about saying, we're not necessarily at the cusp of all these changes right now, but we know it's coming, and we know that this sector is undergoing massive transformation. So this involves, even though the project partner we're working with, the intermediary is Mohawk College, there are employers working very closely in this project, not just at the end and saying, will you hire our graduates, but from the outset of designing the program, thinking about the curriculum, integrated learning in the course of the program to make sure that people are getting the right skills on the job needed, and really help that sector make that transition. We have another project with the Canadian Agricultural Human Resources Council that's thinking a lot about what does the next 10, 15 years look like in the agriculture sector in Canada. What are the labor force needs? What are the skills going to be needed? How can we pivot and adjust and really do some of the anticipatory thinking about sector-wide changes in a specific sector? So those are some of the things we're really interested in supporting. So if we go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is also one of the key issues I want to focus on is just how essential it is that we have an inclusive recovery. So I think this is a graph that nicely shows, how our jobs are recovered, and we know that right hand of the job line, I think that was still mid last year when that line ends, and it just kept going up, 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 right? Like, we know that the recovery's been overall pretty strong, although there are regional variations and variations for different groups. So perhaps in your area, you see the same thing. You see like some pockets where there is still a job shortage or the number of jobs are shifting. Certain employers are having a hard time hiring in certain areas. The skill profiles are changing, right? So one of the things we're really focused on is making sure that we're paying attention to, is this recovery inclusive? Are we, and who's potentially getting left behind in that recovery? We go to the next slide. There was a lot of talk early on about, is it going to be a K-shaped recovery where some jobs are, the income went up. I'm a knowledge worker. I didn't lose my income during COVID. I had other challenges, of course, like many people, but I never had the uncertainty of losing my work and my income. Small business owners of all sizes, people in frontline positions who were affected by the pandemic had a much different reality. And part of, part of the government support programs that were put in place was designed about supporting that bottom leg of the K. So we're thinking, as we come out of that, how do we pay attention to who is affected and who's, how do we make sure that the recovery is inclusive? On to the next slide. So some of the priorities, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we're working on. Funny, I told Jonathan, I said, there's no way I can talk for 40 minutes. No way. And here we go. We're almost at 40. So I'll talk a little bit about critical priorities, and I'd love to hear some of your questions and respond to some of how this relates to the region you're in. So if we go on to the next slide. Thanks. One too far. So the first thing I want to say is, there was, I think the backdrop to some of these mega trends we're talking about, some of the key issues, is thinking about, how labor markets are shifting across Canada and what that means for individuals charting their way through a career. So if you think about, certainly I'm in my mid 40s now, when I started out, when I was given that advice about becoming a taxi dispatcher, the idea was pretty much you go to school, you learn something, and then you enter the working world and you do your job. Maybe now we know that you don't necessarily work at the same company for 30 years like you might have in the past, but we basically see that, okay, you're in a career and that's pretty much where you're working for your career. I think we're realizing increasingly that careers are going to look a lot different in the future. So there's been a lot of talk about lifelong learning. And what does that really mean? It means that we recognize that the skills we have when we're 20-something, when we come out of school, there's a certain skill set, but we're going to continue to need to iterate and develop new skills as we go. And part of what we're doing is thinking about what is the career guidance and advice and information that's needed to help workers make sense of their path through different careers and different career trajectories throughout the course of their life. So there's a lot of times right now, the career guidance and support system in Canada is delivered when you kind of bottom out and fall out of the workforce. So maybe you've lost your job, you're on some employment insurance or social assistance of some sort, and then you get referred into a career guidance thing. We're thinking a lot about how do we make career guidance, advice, labor market information more proactive, and so people can map out where they want to go in their career and thinking proactively about that and about investing in learning. So I think a couple things come to mind when we think of that is we have a tool, and Sylvia, I'm going to ask you again. We have a tool at opportunext.ca that we've launched in conjunction with the conference board, where you can look at the skills that you have in your current occupation and then map them and say, how do they relate to other occupations? What are some related occupations that I might move into, that relate to the next stepping stone in my career. We also are working closely with the Labor Market Information Council about a data hub that is, for employers or workforce development agencies or training organizations to help develop tools that are applied and useful for helping people make sense of where to go in their career. So guidance is not something that only happens when you're a young person thinking of what you're going to do, but guidance kind of follows you throughout your life. And we recognize that investing in skills and knowledge and learning is going to be something that we do throughout our life course. So this is, I think, a key issue and priority for the Future Skills Center going forward, and something that we're working on closely with many of our partners. If we go on to the next slide, I think some of this is kind of some of the, all of this is the backdrop of just how many people are going to need to switch occupations. So I think, as I said before, while we may have had the total number of jobs rebound after the pandemic, when we actually dig into the deeper level of like how many of those jobs are where, the picture starts to look a little differently. And then we generally find, we actually just released a paper with the OECD comparing Canadians and using career guidance to kind of other benchmark countries like the UK, the US, and so on. And, Canadians use career guidance far less than other countries. So we see this as a real opportunity for Canada to invest proactively in helping people think about their careers. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide. Yes, I would just say part of the reason we're so vested in this is that we know and we hear from private sector partners, sector councils, large employers, small employers, that skills profiles are shifting. And, maybe you've heard in the media and things that the number of unfilled positions because people aren't finding the skills talent they need. So this idea of lifelong learning is being felt across the skills and training ecosystem. So if we go to the next slide. So I think I mentioned before, thinking about some of the, anticipating changes in sectors before they even occur. I think one of the things we're really focused on, we launched several projects last fall around sectoral transformations. I mentioned the one with the Human Resources Council of Canada. We're also working closely with the Black Business Professionals Association and thinking about Black-led businesses and small enterprises and how they're navigating the pandemic. So we're very much taking a lens of what are the things that sectors and business leaders are thinking about in terms of skills, and how can we try new things and work closely with these partners and bring together different people across the labor market. So both the supply of labor and skills, like the education and training centers, as well as the demand with employers, and think more holistically about how we're making that transition. Next slide, please. And then we're also focusing on, with a big focus on green economy. So we just released a paper, I believe last week, with the Conference Board of Canada, modeling some of the green occupations coming in Canada and doing some national level modeling about what that looks like. We have another paper coming out with the Smart Prosperity next week. But really, I think the next phase of this will be to make it even more concrete and tangible in what this looks like. So as part of our work in kind of building out the green economy ideas, we talk to a lot of climate organizations, and there's the Canadians for Climate Choices on the West Coast. There was just a big report from the UN this week about the climate issues. And one consistent thing we're seeing is that a lot of the climate science people are saying, there's usually something where they say, there's going to be a lot of labor effects. But nobody's really took the time or had the mandate to really focus on what are those labor effects around a green economy and green growth. And there's both the disruption from, perhaps declining oil and gas. We hear talk about that in Alberta and Newfoundland, talk about a just transition to transition workers out of oil and gas. But we also need to think about what are the skills and profiles needed to actually drive a green future. So what is the innovations that are going to be needed? So we'll actually be launching a new initiative this year that will be focused on thinking about the skills and labor needed to meet Canada's emission targets. So we aren't going to just automatically meet our emission targets by 2030, I believe is the goal, and 2050. But we need to actually be investing in certain skills and capacities right now to be able to meet those targets. So we really think that labor can be a bigger part of the climate discussion going forward. All right, so move on. Yes, and then as I said, I think that the cross-cutting theme across all of our work is thinking about, not just are these skills and training programs working, but who are they working for and under what conditions? And how can we make sure that the recovery and the post-COVID era we're entering, hopefully post-COVID, is inclusive, and that has opportunities for Canada to Canadians across the country, across all different regions and territories, including in the north, to have an inclusive recovery. We move on. Okay. So I think this is my summary slide where I say, we're looking to the future. We have 2 years left in our mandate, but we're in discussions with partners and hope to have a mandate to continue. In the meantime, I think you'll continue to see more from us over the coming year that will, start to share the lessons and insights coming out of our projects, including, wait, I thought I had one. Oh yes, okay, I do have one more on some of the things we're learning. So if we go to the next slide, I did put one slide in here. Because we have several projects that are close to wrapping up, if we move on one more, Jonathan. Yeah, so I said, effective skills training, some of the things we're seeing is, I think, a common thread throughout many of our innovation projects interventions. We're seeing employer engagement throughout, so employers engaged throughout the program, not just at the end, like please hire, the people we've trained, but also thinking about the design and engagement throughout. Participant focus, so laser focused on what those participants need, what they come in with, what they are bringing to bear into the program. Early assessment of skills levels, so some sort of assessment tool. We have various ones that we're piloting that we'll be sharing more information about, but some assessment of skills, not just education. Education was always used as a proxy, a certificate or a degree was always used as somewhat of a proxy that, if you had the certificate, you knew how to do X, Y, and Z things. So we're really seeing a shift from, thinking about certifications to more thinking about skills themselves. Leveraging technology, clearly that's one of the ways to manage costs, but also to stay relevant in the future. Wraparound support, some of these, especially when we're dealing with populations that have significant challenges, perhaps in, having stable employment in the past or have certain, language barriers or cultural adaptations. We're really seeing, strong wraparound support needed. It can't just be, here's some skills to do a job, but how can we support you to make that transition? Personalized services, some of the, as much as we want to get to scale and to cost considerations, which are always on our mind as we think about scaling programs across Canada, is thinking about that human contact to help somebody, develop skills and move through a program. So we're really looking for that sweet spot of just enough personalization to make it work, but enough kind of technological delivery or automation to actually also make it cost effective. And then, of course, we're really invested in longitudinal tracking. So it isn't enough to have somebody complete a program, but what happens when somebody leaves a program? How is their engagement with an employer? Are employers happy with their work? Do they have the skills needed to thrive in the future? So we're really investing in that longitudinal tracking of participants. So we know that the future won't look like the past. If there's one thing that's assured and constant is that we need to shift and adapt. But I think we're excited to be on the journey with so many great partners and to help lead and guide some of this work in Canada. So let me pause there, and I've seen questions pop up in the chat, but I have to admit I haven't been reading them yet, but I'm excited for you to tell me what I should be paying attention to, Jonathan.
No problem. Yeah, first of all, thank you. That was very, very in-depth. Yeah, and we did have a few questions show up. And also, if you do have questions right now, feel free to put them into the chat and I'll bring them up, I guess. Well, since I'm here and I'm talking, I have one question I'll ask, then we'll get to the audience questions. But you did mention like career pathing and obviously the importance of for everybody, old or young, established, precariously employed or not, like just thinking down the road what what changes might be coming and what you should be thinking about. Yeah, I would say most of our sort of career models or job training are based on either like a younger audience, people just entering the labor force, or people who maybe at a transition period where they've lost their job or precariously employed. So you did mention like a few countries that are doing a better or maybe more advanced in terms of opening up career pathing to everyone. I know like you could pay privately for career counseling and things like that. It's very expensive, but are there countries or models that are kind of leading the way with, that kind of career pathing that you talked about?
I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, everyone loves to talk about Germany, and the apprenticeship models they have in Germany are super strong, right? Like they just have a very, very integrated employer engagement in their apprenticeship system, at least, in certain kind of skilled trades I'm talking about specifically. I think it's something we're still uncovering what that looks like, but I think it makes sense, like what you're saying is that, if like you're not alone in that. You're saying, usually guidance and career planning is either at the start of your career journey or when you're kind of falling out of labor force for various reasons. And I think we're trying to uncover, how can we take a slightly different approach? So we actually just recently launched we released a call for proposals with the Labor Market Information Council to work with intermediary organizations, so career service organizations, around designing labor market information tools or services that might be addressing some of this problem or this challenge. So how do we engage people with labor market information so they can be thinking about their next step before they lose their job, right? So they can be doing that thinking themselves and thinking, okay, what are my opportunities? What do I have in this? How can I, think proactively? That also takes a certain mindset shift, right? A mindset shift of thinking of yourself as a lifelong learner and saying, I want to develop and I want to grow in my skills and remain relevant and employable in this future of work. So I'd say, we're still uncovering what it is about Canada that thinks that, career guidance is something either you do early or you do like when things are in massive trouble. So it's going to take some work, I think, across the skills ecosystem in Canada, including with career practitioners, with individuals themselves, and helping, I think, develop that culture of learning. But I think overall, I have to admit, I think our system hasn't been set up to innovate. Funding sources tend to reward you for getting people through programs. And so I would say, it's a bit of a challenge to some of the funders and some of the policy makers to think about how do we encourage the system to innovate in different ways. And those are some of the conversations we're having.
So yeah, a few questions, and I'll just warn you up front, these are big ones. But so one, I guess, is just in terms of future of work, also future of economies. But do you see tensions or contradictions between shifting to a green economy and a capitalist economy system? So what do you think sustainable capitalism world order looks like?
Can you still hear me? I think
I can still hear you. Yeah, no,
okay,
we can
great,
still hear you.
Yeah, no, this is great. This is why I joined by phone. Look, I think that's a great question. And I think, we have a capitalism-based economy, right? And I think we're not trying to shift that. But I do think we need to think about sustainability and valuing different elements I think historically, I would argue, I mean, this is an argument, it isn't necessarily an FSC position. I would argue that, maybe we've undervalued some of the human capital dimensions or some of the future costs, right? The market tends to be not so good at placing a price or a value on future costs. So I don't see those as incompatible. I do think we need to have a better and more nuanced understanding of what those costs are. So part of what we'll be doing in some of the partnerships we're launching this year will be to not just do a 30,000 foot view of what, green skills or green jobs looks like, but to get really focused. So it might be thinking about what does, I don't know, what are some of the big sectors and employer in the Algoma region, Jonathan? Remind me, we talked about this last week.
Well, I mean, it's similar to the province. I mean, healthcare is obviously big. We have manufacturing. We do also have obviously resources like gold and forestry.
So
retail,
thinking if we thought about the extractives or the forestry sector in Northern Ontario, if we thought about like how would we approach that with a sustainability lens, and then you say what are the skills that we need to do this in a more sustainable way. So I think there's opportunity there to do that thinking. So I don't see them as incompatible, but I think if you don't do the analysis, it'd be very easy to say this is not possible. But I think part of what we're trying to bring to the picture is that more nuanced thinking about how this affects different people and communities and perhaps ways that haven't been articulated before.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just like to add that I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. I mean, I mean, I don't think we can call it the green economy anymore. It's just our economy. So like one of our large manufacturers is Algoma Steel. They're transitioning to electric arc-based steel manufacturing, so much more environmentally friendly than their coke ovens, which was very much a last century type technology. So I just think it's the nature of the beast. Obviously, we have big issues going on in the world, and it's based on probably on oil. So if we can bring our power production more regionally or locally, and we're in Algoma, I mean, we're a net exporter of power. That's mostly green power, so hydro, solar, so I think there are opportunities all over the place. I think most people are recognizing that, and that change is going to happen rapidly. So we do have a few more questions here. So
sure.
And this is a big one. So what advice can you give students, elementary, secondary, post-secondary, regarding preparing for future careers? I mean, you've already covered a lot, but if you had to sort of sum it up, if you had a student in front of you, what would you say?
So it's funny because I had this even more recently I have a young daughter myself, and sometimes I look at her and I think, what will she be doing in the future, right? Like what job will she have 20 years from now? Or, nieces and nephews who say, Aunt Trish, what should I do in the future of work? I think actually my advice is, it's very tempting to say, here's a sector that's going to grow, or here's a specific occupation. And I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. Absolutely follow your passions. If you care about healthcare, go into healthcare. If you care about building things and you want to be in, trades, go into it. But I think what my biggest advice would be, see yourself as, or recognize that you're going to invest in learning and skills throughout your life. You're not going to just get a job and stay in it, but thinking about how can I grow throughout my life in this area. Certainly investing in some core skills are going to be essential. Everyone needs a basic digital technological literacy. You'll see, My daughter was playing doctor with a friend a few weeks ago, and they pretended they were typing on a computer, and that was their way of pretending they were a doctor, right? Because they were going to type on a computer, not necessarily like, check their temperature or something. So the miming around the jobs is different, and I think that reflects the recognition that being a doctor involves using technology. But I would also say that in the future of work, I think humans are going to be playing those very human roles, right? So it isn't so much, think of a pharmacist, for instance. Pharmacist tends to say, okay, I noticed you have these two medications, there may be potential interactions. Well, now they get flagged by their computer system, right? So the computer might do that thinking of saying, there's a potential interaction effect with these two medications that a patient's on. So the pharmacist, of course, needs to understand why that is and to be able to think articulately about it. But they actually need to be able to have that conversation with the patient, with the client. And I was speaking with a professor from the pharmacy department at the University of Toronto, and he says we do not teach for that. What they're teaching about right now is the science of it, how the medications interact, and those things. But actually what they need to be learning to be really successful in the future is how to leverage the technological knowledge with the very human skills of relating to people. So I would say, some core skills like technological literacy, social and emotional skills, working with people, those are the things I think that are going to cut across every sector. And then really having that mindset of lifelong learning, of this is a journey that we're on, and we'll continue to innovate and learn and invest and upskill ourselves throughout our careers.
Excellent. That obviously is a great summary. I think we will end it there, but did you have any final comments you would like to make?
No, just thanks everyone for joining, and I'm really glad to see there's an evaluation, and I just encourage you all to sign up at the Future Skills Center. We just had a summit last week at a big event, but there's some recordings there, and we have a newsletter if you want to sign up for that, and really glad that I could be part of this. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Tricia. That was an excellent presentation. Once again, we have recorded it. So if you do want to return to the AWIC website, it's at awic.ca. If you go to our events section, you'll see all our recordings there. Tricia, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone that attended today. If you do happen to have a question that we didn't get to, I can certainly forward it to Tricia, and we can get that to her. I will say we do have an upcoming webinar next week. This is on our remote work webinar series. So obviously more people are looking at working remotely and hybrid work. So we're going to be joined by Ian Grant from ATS, so the Algoma Technical Services Company. And he's just going to be talking about some of the technical considerations you should be thinking about, beyond just give everyone a laptop. So, security, cloud storage, all those sorts of questions. Ian's our man to answer those. So hope you can join us next week. You can register online. But for now, thank you very much, Tricia. And I'm excited, obviously, about the future of work and changes that are coming. I think we're at a very, obviously, a clearly interesting time in the world as technology changes. Our economies are changing, and I think the future is going to be great for for hopefully getting everybody engaged and working at full capacity. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. No problem. It's my pleasure.
And, thanks again. Bye-bye.